Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give it a couple of minutes to fill the room up here. Good afternoon again, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll give it another minute to fill up the room. And we'll give it about 30 more seconds here. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again for our weekly Wednesday webinar series. Today's webinar is on the NIH UNITE Initiative to End Structural Racism. My name is Brett Spatale, and I'm the Vice President of Advancement here at the National Hemophilia Foundation. At any point during the webinar, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We have NHF staff members monitoring these questions, which we will pose to our presenter after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to the community beginning on Friday, October 8th. I'm joined today by Victoria Rucker, who is the Program Manager for the UNITE Initiative at NIH. Thanks for taking the time to join us today, Victoria. I'll now turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you to you all for the invitation. I'm excited to be here today to talk with you more about the NIH's UNITE Initiative. As Brett mentioned, this initiative is dedicated to ending structural racism in biomedical research. So the events of the past 18 months, including the murder of George Floyd, the morbidity and the mortality of the COVID-19 pandemic, along with the killings of Asian women in Atlanta in 2021, have really brought into sharp relief the ongoing reality of racial injustice in our country. And we made a clear commitment that it was a responsibility of all of us to address this issue. To give you an idea of this is what motivated us to act. We came together as a community with our institute and center directors, number of intense meetings around what was happening in the world around us and how that was impacting the science here at the NIH. Excuse me, two affinity groups at the NIH that are self-assembled, one being 8 Changes for Racial Equity, or ACRE, the other being African American and Black scientists, along with the Anti-Harassment Steering Committee, met with the NIH leadership to talk about what the next steps might look like as we're grappling with what to do regarding racial injustice and how that impacts not only the NIH, but our science. Again, we developed a shared commitment to address structural racism head on and realize that we could not let this moment pass. We're at a pivotal moment in our history as a country, as a world, and we really needed to strike now in order to effect change. We identified early on some initial needs that we thought as an organization we needed to address. We wanted to ensure that biomedical research and the administrative system that supports it is devoid of hostility grounded in race, sex, and other federally protected characteristics. This new initiative, or the UNITE Initiative, would be committed to delineating elements that may perpetuate structural racism in biomedical research, both within the NIH and the extramural community, leading to a lack of personnel inclusiveness, equity, and diversity. We identified that all ideas must be given an equal and fair review without regard to current dogma, precedents, or who presents the ideas. Oftentimes we see that who's at the table is not as diverse or inclusive as we would like it to be. And so really being mindful of who is invited to the table and how can we ensure more people are at that table in order, again, to advance our science. And then as COVID-19 has made painfully clear, health disparities and inequities continue to contribute to morbidity and mortality here in the United States and beyond, and making it essential to redress the fundamental causes of these disparities and inequities in order to identify research programs that could lead to effective interventions. When you're confronted with what we know in this space, there is, I think we all came to the realization that we needed to act. And so those were the needs that we identified early on as being the main focus of what the UNITE initiative would be addressing. And so what is the UNITE initiative? Well, each letter in UNITE stands for a different committee that's dedicated to a different topic. And I'm going to go through each one of those for each of you. So the U in UNITE stands for understanding stakeholder experiences through listening and learning. We learned very early on, our Dr. Collins would say this to you, the NIH director, that those two self-assembled affinity groups, ACRE and the African American and Black scientist groups that sat down with them, he learned so much just from listening and learning from those two groups that was one of the main things we wanted to incorporate into this UNITE initiative, was really listening to experiences both at the NIH and beyond. We had a RFI, or request for information, that went out to everyone, the general public, the NIH workforce, our extramural community. Anyone who wanted to respond was welcome to respond. We received over, I think it was close to 1,200 responses to that RFI, and we are still working through the data, but look forward to sharing the results of that with all of you once we have that completed. We also have been conducting listening and learning sessions across the NIH enterprise, along with outside of the enterprise in our extramural communities as well. We will be working beyond that, reaching out to some of our colleges and universities, other community organizations as well, to hear their experiences in this space. And then we also did a call across all of our institutes and centers. We have 27 institutes and centers, and the OD office, which isn't an institute or center, but we do count them amongst the 28 bodies under the NIH. Each one of those entities sent in information what they were doing in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So we've had a better understanding of the landscape with regard to DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility efforts across the NIH. The N in the UNITE initiative stands for new research on health disparities, minority health, and health equity. We know, again, that health disparities exist. We also know that COVID-19, again, has really brought those into sharp reality for us, that there are significant disparities with regard to underrepresented groups. And so we're doing new research, or conducting new research, to identify health disparities, to advance health equity, and to better understand minority health and health concerns related to underrepresented groups. The I can also be thought of as internal, right? So improving the NIH culture and structure for equity, inclusion, and excellence, really looking at internally at our internal workforce, and what are some of the disparities that exist within our workforce, and how are the members of our workforce being impacted by structural racism. So looking at what's happening in our own house, so to speak. The T in UNITE stands for transparency, communication, and accountability with our internal and external stakeholders. So this is our communications arm. They're the ones who are making sure that we're telling our story, that we have a better understanding of what needs to be communicated across the UNITE landscape, and also holding us accountable to what we said we were going to do. So I'm going to go through a number of the recommendations that were made, and the T committee is right there making sure that we are staying true to what we said we're going to do. And if those things change, being sure that we're communicating effectively across all of our stakeholder groups so that they understand why changes were made and what we plan to do instead of what we may have originally recommended. And finally, the E in UNITE stands for the extramural research ecosystem, which looks at changing policy, culture, and structure in order to promote workforce diversity. So the I in UNITE stands for our internal workforce, and the E in UNITE stands for our external or extramural workforce. While we don't have as much control, so to speak, over our extramural workforce because they're working in different universities and foundations across the globe, for that matter, we do have some pull in. Well, if we're going to have funding, if we're going to have these funding announcements out, what are some of the things we can think of to ensure that those entities are thinking through how to make their organizations more equitable as well? So let's jump into some of those recommendations I told you I was going to talk with you about. One of the first things that came out of those conversations was that if we are going to talk about addressing a problem, we have to acknowledge that there is a problem. And so what a display of courageous leadership by our current director, NIH Director, Dr. Francis Collins. And I say current because just yesterday, he announced that he will be stepping down as our NIH Director and returning to leading his research lab in our national, his research lab in our Genome Institute. But what he did March 1st was made a public declaration apologizing for acknowledging the impact of structural racism on our research. And this is what he said: to those individuals in the biomedical research enterprise who have endured disadvantages due to structural racism, I am truly sorry. NIH is committed to instituting new ways to support diversity, equity, and inclusion, and identifying and dismantling any policies and practices at our own agency that may harm our workforce and our science. Again, what courageous leadership to be able to acknowledge it and then own it and apologize to anyone who's been disadvantaged because of structural racism. The next thing that was recommended was to continually implement approaches to address the Ginter gap and enhance our portfolio for diversity, and enhance our diversity portfolio. So I will just give you an overview of this chart, what this is. This is the applicants and the funding. Well, I'm going to start with applicants and then I'll switch over to the funding rates of the applicants in fiscal year 2013 compared to fiscal year 2020. The number of applicants that we received, as you can see, is there's a pretty significant disparity here between the number of applications received in 2013. The yellow bar indicates our white applicants, the gray bar is our Asian applicants, the blue bar is our Hispanic applicants. This purple, light purple, lavender bar is where it says 18 is our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander applicants. The red bar is African American and Black applicants, and then this brighter purple bar is our American Indian and Alaska Native applicants. What was identified was, compared to all other ethnic groups, African Americans and Black applicants represented a much smaller number of applications compared to the rest of the racial and ethnic groups that were identified, I just mentioned. So in 2013, 1.8% of all applications received came from African American and Black applicants. And again, and the other disparity that was acknowledged is the number of Hispanic applicants, which were 4.4% of all applications received in 2013 were Hispanic. Now here, let's juxtapose that with 2020's numbers. We see a bump of about 0.5% number of applicants received between 2013 and 2020, which is for African American and Black scientists, and about nearly a 1% increase for Hispanic, but still very far below where we would want to be. And so we have a long way to go, but we are seeing promise as far as those numbers are starting to increase. And now let's talk about funding rates. So again, we see a disparity here. Of all of the applications that were funded, 1.1% of those applications went to African Americans and Blacks, and 3.7% went to Hispanics, and that was in 2013. Again, we're seeing some improvement, 0.7 improvement between 2013 and 2020 for African American and Black scientists, and a little bit over 1% in our numbers for Hispanic scientists, or excuse me, Hispanic applications. So as you can see, we are moving in a good direction, but we still have a long way to go in order to achieve true racial equity at the NIH with regard to our funding. We also, let me go back, my apologies. We also recommended that we launch a multi-phased, multi-tiered, and multi-integrated common fund initiative focused on transformative health disparities, research initiatives to reduce health disparities and inequities. This request for applications was published in March of 2021. And there were two FOAs were released in March of 2021, specifically looking at addressing health disparities and advancing health equity with a commitment of up to $24 million. The first was looking at transformative research to address health disparities and advance health equity. And the second was transformative research to address health disparities and advance health equity at minority serving institutions. So that was the difference between the two. One was looking broadly and one was focused mainly on minority serving institutions. That would include your historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, or HSIs, and your tribal colleges and universities, or TCUs, etc. Another initial recommendation was to ensure a robust NIH Enterprisewide Commitment to support the NIMHD, or our National Institute for Minority Health and Health Disparities, FOA, that was focused on the effects of structural racism and discrimination on health disparities and inequities, and encourage funding levels that are commensurate with overall IC resources. I am pleased to tell you that this was published in March of 2021, and 25 of our institute centers, and I told you the Office of Director is the 28th, so to speak, of those entities underneath the NIH. But under the Office of the Director, there are a number of different offices. So we call ICOs, institutes, centers, and OD offices. That's the O in the ICOs, but 25 of them signed on to support this FOA with a commitment of up to $30.8 million. Applications were due last August, and we are excited to see what comes of all of those efforts. We also recommended that we develop a sustainable process to systematically gather and make public the demographics of our internal and external workforce. And so it's happening. This is great news. NIH data by race, ethnicity, and disability status is now available in our Office of Extramural Research, utilizing what's called the NIH Data book. There is a link to this, and I will make sure that these slides are made available to you to use them as a resource later. So that is happening now. And we also, on our Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion website, post the data of our workforce. So not just our applicants and from the extramural workforce, but also what's happening internally. So we do have this demographics data available regarding NIH's own internal workforce available on our website. We have some additional recommendations. As you can see, we did a lot of thinking and talking about what could we do in order to really propel us into achieving racial equity in our organization. And so we have a number of different recommendations, but I'm going through what the initial ones were. As you can see, it's a very long list, but I'm pleased that I can actually back that up with things that we've actually done. It was a recommendation and then we implemented. So that's good news. But one of those things was to develop a performance expectation for all institute and center directors in order to be held accountable for equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts, and to actively participate in NIH-wide diversity efforts through a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer or other means that are appropriate for that particular institute or center in coordination with our Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity and our Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We have initiated this one as well, and this will go into effect in our IC directors, or excuse me, Institute and Center Directors PMAPs or performance appraisals effective this year. We also are seeking to expand the Distinguished Scholars Program to senior investigators hired with tenure and enhance recruitment of researchers from underrepresented groups as candidates for open IRP investigator positions. So we currently have a program in place called the Distinguished Scholars Program that tends to bring in a number of diverse applicants, and our the actual makeup of the cohorts of these programs tend to be extremely diverse. And so we're expanding that to senior investigators that are hired with tenure. And we've already initiated that one as well. One thing we'll note is this isn't something that we are doing, but it was a recommendation and people are listening. But in order to facilitate health disparity, minority health, and health equity research, President Biden's budget has proposed increased funding specifically to enhance that research, health disparity, minority health, and health equity research for our National Institute for Minority Health and Health Disparities, our National Institute for Nursing Research, our National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and our Fogarty International Center. We also wanted to ensure that we continue to listen and learn from a wide variety of stakeholders, including those who are not frequently engaged, whose voices are underrepresented in these kinds of conversations across our science. Not even just these conversations related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but overall, our science, who's underrepresented, who's not at the table with regard to our science, the science that we are conducting at the NIH, and how can we ensure that those voices who aren't frequently engaged are becoming to be more regularly invited to the table. And learning from a variety of stakeholders. This is what I'm doing here today. I look forward to learning from you all as well. Even though I'm presenting a lot of information to you, I look forward to our question and answer so I can hear more of those things that are impacting you all and bring that back to the work that we're doing. So I went through our initial recommendations. There was about 10 or 12 of them. And now, in addition to those, we have some recommendations moving forward over the next 6 months or so. Things that we really do think, in addition to what we've originally, I originally identified as the way forward when we first launched the UNITE initiative. Some other things have come up since then, and so I'm going to share those with you as well. But to develop actionable data dashboards that track and provide visualizations of our intramural workforce and NIH's health disparities, minority health, and health equity research investments with key performance indicators and metrics. And I'm pleased to say we are working on that. And the intramural piece will be available to our intramural workforce, I believe, by the end of October, by the end of this month. And we have a whole data group that's working on developing a dashboard for anyone to access. So this would be available across our, this would be available on our external facing website for anyone who is interested in understanding better what investments the NIH is making with regard to health disparities, minority health, and health equity research. We are also looking at additional FOAs that focus on IC-specific disease topic areas related to health disparities, minority health, and health equity. And so when we look at our ICs in particular, for instance, NHLBI, our National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, what are some areas or specific disease areas or topics related to HDMH and HE research that we could put more funding into? Develop programs to spur institutional culture change in support of inclusivity and equity. So what can we do across the NIH workforce that spur institutional culture change? And one of those things that we've done is create an anti-racism steering committee for our NIH workforce. That currently consists of 518 members as of today, 518 people who, in addition to the 80 or so people involved with the UNITE initiative, and all of these people are volunteering their time. So we're looking at about nearly 600 people dedicated to dismantling structural racism and achieving or enhancing racial equity at the NIH and beyond. Increase URG or underrepresented group career opportunities, starting with increasing institute and center participation in the Science Education Partnership Award, which targets K through 12 STEM education. So getting more of our institutes and centers to participate in SEPA. And we're starting to have those conversations now, which is also very exciting. We also want to look at staff interactions, our own NIH interactions with applicants, in particular underrepresented group applicants, or for example, I should say, to address bias or inequities that may impact funding opportunities. So are our POs or SROs entering into these decisions and carrying with them their own biases, or carrying with them biases that may impact in a negative way funding opportunities for others. So really examining our own staff interactions. In addition, we want to develop programs to expand NIH interactions with and in support of HBCUs, TCUs, and other MSIs, which are minority serving institutions. Changing our physical and virtual representations at the NIH to more accurately reflect the diversity of our society. So if you were to walk through the NIH halls right now, although I'm not there right now, I'm at home, working from home, like many of you all may be. But if you were to walk through the NIH, what you would see were a number of scientists who have made wonderful contributions to our science and our work at the NIH, but a number of them are white men, the faces of white men all over our halls. And we know that there have been many contributions by many different people that are more reflective of our overall society and are more reflective of the diversity of our overall society. And so we're really looking at how do we put other faces up on the walls in our space, and how can we better virtually represent the richness of our diversity. And so we're currently doing an overhaul of the physical portraiture throughout the NIH, along with the visual portraiture that you'll see in our websites and on our brochures as well. We're also, there was a recommendation to publish revised NIH internal guidance for reporting racial discrimination. Currently, you all may have heard in about 2017, Dr. Collins made a declaration that he would no longer serve on panels that were just men. He called them manels. I will not do that. I will not, if there are not women at the table, I will no longer serve on panels where there are no men, or excuse me, no women. And he expanded that to say, also they must be diverse in a number of different ways. But that work in 2017 really came out of our anti-harassment efforts at the NIH. We recognized back then, just like we are understanding better today, but back then we really had and are continuing to grapple with issues with regard to sexual harassment and disparate treatment for women. And so we created this NIH internal guidance that addressed sexual harassment. Well, fast forward to today, we understand that harassment doesn't necessarily have to just be with regard to sex or gender, but can also expand across race and other ethnic groups. And so we wanted to expand that current guidance to include racial discrimination. And that one is also underway and ready to be published, the updated version. I would be remiss if I did not. So those are the recommendations. That's what we're doing moving forward over the next 6 months. And I look forward to maybe another year from now coming back and telling you what we've actually were able to accomplish, and then some of the metrics and how we've been able to measure our success. But I would be remiss if I didn't at least show you these 80 people who make up the NIH UNITE Initiative. We are led by 3 co-chairs, which includes our Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity, NIH's Principal Deputy Director, which is Dr. Collins number 2, so to speak, and our NIH Deputy Director for Management. So Marie Bernard serves as our Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity. Dr. Lawrence Tabak, Dr. Marie Bernard, I should have said. Dr. Lawrence Tabak is our Principal Deputy Director, and Dr. Alfred Johnson is our Deputy Director for Management. I currently serve as the Program Manager for UNITE. We have 2 additional members who serve as program support. And then each of the committees, 5 different supporting the UNITE initiative in each of those committees, and they're led. Each committee is led by their own committee co-chairs, and each committee also has either 1 or 4 staff leads who offer some additional support to those committees. So you can see there's a number of people who are involved in the UNITE effort. And as I mentioned, nearly all of them are volunteering their time dedicated to ending structural racism and enhancing racial equity at the NIH and beyond. And then we'll leave you just with this quote here. I'll take the last 30 minutes or so for questions. But Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., this is a very popular quote that says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And one of the things that we hold very true to with regard to the UNITE effort is that, yes, we are focused on ending structural racism within the biomedical research enterprise, but we're learning so much about the impacts and the effects of discrimination and the lack of inclusion that impacts other groups as well. So when we're doing this work, how do we look at our disability community? How are we looking at our LGBTQ employees? So really taking lessons learned and applying them more broadly across our workforce and our landscape to ensure that we are achieving equity, not just racial equity, but equity, diversity, and inclusion in a grand scale across our research enterprise. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Brett, for any questions you all may want to ask. Should I stop sharing now so you can just
Sure, yeah, that'd be great, Victoria. And we do have several questions that came in, and I will kick us off here with this one. It is often difficult to get connected to underrepresented groups in order to hear their voices. How are you reaching out and building trust with underrepresented communities to create a comfortable space for them to share their lived experiences?
That is a really, really good question. And I will venture to say it's not just groups outside of the NIH, but it's something we've learned within the NIH, right? So my answer to that would be how we are entering community, how we're entering spaces that may be skeptical or have felt as though they've been left out of the conversation. So why now, right? We hear that a lot. But what I will tell you is one of the things that we've done is initially just making outreach, saying this is what we're doing. And again, that the request for information that we received 1,200 responses to went out across multiple different communication streams and whatnot. The general public could respond to that as well. But one of the things that we made really clear was that we could not come out and say, this is what we're going to do and then not follow through. There is a level of distrust that we are encountering in these conversations we're having, but we are trying to enter those spaces with a level of humility. We can dish it, we need to hear it. We need to hear it in its raw form, because change doesn't happen when we're comfortable. We only make change when we're uncomfortable. When you think about, when you buy a new house, it's because you've outgrown the older house, right? Or you buy a new car because the old car stops working. Well, we can't make sustainable change or meaningful change unless we're uncomfortable. And so we're having to have some real, sometimes hard conversations, and having to look in the mirror and really examine how we've contributed to this problem in order to change behavior.
That's great. Well said, Victoria. Thank you. And that leads well into this question, I believe. What pushback did you receive in undertaking this project, if any?
Well, I will tell you the good news. Let's start with the good news, and then we'll go to I won't say it's bad news, but I'll go to the other side of it. The good news is that when Dr. Collins, and I said courageous leadership when I described him, the head of our organization saying, watching the murder of George Floyd opened my eyes in a way that I had not had them open in a long time. Say that it reminded him of the civil rights movement when things were televised, and he's like, I'm white, I didn't have to see it. Well, I was looking at someone murdered in front of, for everyone to see, and that was shocking. But it took a level of courageous leadership for him to say, enough is enough. And I understand, based on the conversations I'm having with these affinity groups, that I'm contributing to the problem. So when he went out to, and I said we had these intense conversations with our institute and center leadership, they were intense, but none of them said we weren't supportive of this. So to have the backing of our leaders from across the NIH saying, yep, this is what we need to be doing, the time is right, let's do it now, was very helpful. That energy. And then when I will tell you, when I talk with others across, be it the federal government or outside organizations that aren't necessarily federal government, but organizations like the NHF, one of the things that that I hear repeatedly is you have leadership buy-in. They're saying this at the very top. Wow, that's impressive that it's, that someone at the very top of your organization is willing to lead this effort in this direction. So we have a lot of backing from our top leaders across the NIH, which then means that it trickles out to everybody else. When you see that the top leaders of the NIH are saying this is what we need to do and we're going to do it, I think that has helped. And I will say there's a different tone this time around. People actually believe something is going to happen, because it's not just the choir that's preaching now, so to speak. It's everyone, people are now hearing from people who they've never heard from before saying structural racism, actually using that word, or racial equity, and that we're going to do something about it. So that has been very promising. We have received some pushback from, I will say, mostly people within our workforce. That's what I've heard. I'm still awaiting the RFI results, or the analysis, I should say, of the request for information. But within our own workforce, we have gotten some pushback saying things like, the NIH is just about science. Why are we making this political? And so there's work that we need to do around educating our own workforce on how achieving racial equity doesn't take away from anyone else. And it also doesn't have to be seen as political either. It can simply just mean, and this is what Dr. Collins has said, this is what all of our leadership is saying, that when you have diversity of thought, it leads to greater science or better science. Our Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity has a motto, and it says, great minds think differently. We often say great minds think alike, great minds think differently. And so I'll leave you with that. We have some work to do, but overall, the response has been very positive.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. You are sparking some conversation here. There's lots of questions coming in. I
Right.
promise everyone I'll try to get to them all, but I'll go into this one next. I love the information that the NIH has on their website regarding the diversity of their internal workforce. Is that encouraged externally? How can other organizations do something similar?
That is an excellent question. Well, that's one of the things that when I talked with you earlier about, these are things that we're doing within our internal workforce, and we can't quite impact, we can't force our external workforce to do anything, but we can encourage, strongly encourage. And that's one of the things that we've talked about is we are doing this, and it wasn't easy. It wasn't something that was just, we can just log in and pull it up. We actually had to request it, and we went through this whole process to do so. But when doing that, we said, well, why can't we get that information for our extramural workforce as well? And so those are the conversations we're currently having with our Office of Extramural Research to better make that data more available across our enterprise. So that's a great question. Stay tuned. I hope to have more information on what we're doing in that space the next time I come back and talk.
Great. Great. Thanks again, Victoria. And the next one comes in referring to the applications that you had discussed earlier in the presentations. It says, on these applications, what is the makeup of those on the decision-making process? Is this a blind process, meaning applicant names are hidden?
So I am not the expert on that one. I'm going to come back and answer the second part of that. But I will tell you the question around, is it a blind application process? And I don't believe we are, but I'll get that answer for you. But as far as the makeup of the panels, one of the things that we've instituted at the NIH are requirements around who can be on the panel. So they can't all be from the Northeast, for instance, because we know the Northeast, the Ivy League hub, so to speak, oftentimes people in those positions aren't reflective of our rich diversity across the United States. And so we have a requirement that they all can't be from the Northeast. There has to be representation from both men and women. So there is, they're not quotas. I will be very clear about saying that we cannot, thank you, Lynn. We cannot have any kind of, make it even anyone to question whether or not we have a quota system, be it the number of people we have on a panel or the number of applications we review or the number of people we hire. But we do have some recommendations in place right now that says you have to have diversity on this panel, and it has to be in these kinds of ways. So we don't want to see everyone from the Northeast represented on a panel. You have to have them across the US. So there are some of those things in place to help diversify those panels.
Great. Thanks again, Victoria. Next question comes in. It's a great question. What specific activities are the NIH undertaking to remove barriers for people from underrepresented communities to become scholars? An example would be like access to educational opportunities.
That's a good one. So I did mention our SEPA program, the Science Education Partnership. So I'm blanking on it, I'm talking too fast. But our SEPA program that focuses on K through 12 opportunities, that's a wonderful example of that, where we're trying to encourage more young people to get into STEM, to get into STEM, I'll say it that way. So that's one example of that. But some other things that we have to look at include things like sponsorship. That's come up quite a bit, that people at the NIH who get into positions at the NIH are sponsored by people who are currently at the NIH. And if you have disparities within who's represented at the NIH, those people are bringing in people that they know. And if this is who I know, they tend to look more like me. Well, if more of our leadership and people who are making those decisions are white men, we're going to see more white men coming into positions. So we're really encouraging not just diversifying that, but asking people to look at sponsoring people who may not look like you. How do you serve as a mentor or sponsor to others and bring different people into that landscape, so to speak? So again, great minds think differently. So those are some of the things that we're doing. It's not just the outreach that we're doing outside of the NIH, but really looking inward and identifying ways that we can be more inclusive and do better outreach to members of underrepresented groups.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks, Victoria. The next question that comes in is, how can an organization like NHF interact with the NIH to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion of diverse populations?
Well, this is a great start, right? Just having those conversations and bringing people together is really at the heart of what we're trying to do. You cannot address structural racism without collaborating, without listening, without learning from each other. One of the things, and I will say, I chuckle, not in a like it's really funny, but in a I'm not sure if that's the right word. When we say structural racism, I think what we're talking about really is systemic racism, because structural racism is really a structure that expands across the whole United States. When we talk about our structure, we're talking about not just biomedical research, we're talking about housing, education, labor. We're talking about all of those facets across our society that build a structure that has disadvantaged underrepresented groups over time. We are specifically talking about biomedical research. But in order to impact change across that structure, we have to work together. And so one of the things that we do is we tell this story to anyone who will listen, and encourage you all to partner with us. Do this in your own spaces. We're looking to partner, in order to address, again, structural racism. How do we partner with HUD, for instance, housing and urban development? CDC is looking to start doing work in this area. So other parts of the federal government who work together in order to dismantle structural racism. That's the second part of this conversation, is how do we do more outreach across the entire landscape and really work to dismantle some of those things that are, again, across society, impacting our ability to see racial equity in all of those areas. But it really does just start with these kinds of conversations and building that trust. I think someone asked earlier, how do you build trust? Well, you don't build trust unless you're talking. And so we're starting these conversations and being very humble about the fact that we have a lot to learn. We don't know it all. And so I just would, again, encourage all of you to continue these conversations. I'm so thrilled that you invited us to come in today, and I look forward to continuing these conversations so that we can learn from you all. And that, again, will help inform what we do moving forward.
Great. So this is a bigger question, I guess. I'll say that. But what has been the biggest challenge in designing the UNITE initiative, and how have you overcome this?
So I might have to come back to you a year from now and tell you how we overcame it, because I don't know that we've done that yet. But what I will say is the challenge, and this is me. I don't like to call them challenges. I prefer calling it an opportunity. It's a challenge, but I have to get my brain right and say, okay, this is actually an opportunity for growth, right? But the biggest challenge, I think, was, or has been currently right now, is it feels like and we've said this before, we're building the plane as we're flying it. We didn't know exactly what we were doing. We just had all of these ideas, and it was like, oh my gosh, where do you start? And it's drinking from a fire hose, because there was a lot of work. There is a lot of work to do, and the stakes are very high. We are talking about people. We are talking about lives. We are talking about health. We are talking about real things. It's not just some made up thing that, oh yeah, that's nice. No, this is actually impacting people. And so when you're dealing with people and that human connection, the stakes are so high to get it wrong. You don't want to get it wrong, right? You want to get it right. And yet we have to have enough humility to know that we're going to mess up along the way. We are not going to always do the right thing or say the right thing. We're going to learn a lot. But I think the biggest challenge has been knowing even just where to start. There's so much energy. I told you we have an anti-racism steering committee of 500 and some people, and trying to manage that energy. That's not a bad problem to have, but it does give us information in the sense that this is really impacting our workforce and beyond in a real way. And so we have work to do, yes, but we have to try to get it right. And so that may mean that things take a little bit longer, and that can lead to frustration. People want to see change and they want to see it now. And so how do you couple that with, yeah, we have to have some small wins or some quick wins, so to speak, but understanding that in order to move that ship in a whole different direction, it's going to take years to really see some of the fruits of this labor that we've been, this labor of love, so to speak, that we've embarked upon. So I would say the biggest challenge is not really knowing what we were going to do, because there was so much to do. But then also being mindful of that human connection and making sure that, you know, we're keeping in mind that this is impacting lives, and how do we do this and do this right with not just from an equitable perspective, but from an ethical perspective. So there's a lot to consider when we're moving forward.
Yeah, no, that's great insight, Victoria. Thank you. The next question is, what elements of the UNITE initiative would you like for other organizations to implement?
Oh, all of them.
Yeah.
I would love all of those things. So what I will say now, if we just look at the letters of UNITE, the U, understanding the different stakeholders. If we did more listening and learning from each other, wow, what could we do? Imagine what we could do if we actually truly wanted to listen and learn from each other, not listening to I'm going to listen so I can say the next thing, but I actually just want to hear you. And putting yourself out there to be a student of other people's experiences. I would love those who have the ability to do research in these areas to actually do that research in those areas. We have, we talk about that, oftentimes we talk about, when we talk about minority health and health disparities, it's, oh, well, this person is, and I'll use myself, I'm a Black Filipina woman, I should be interested in that. Well, I don't have to just be interested in minority health and health disparities. I can be interested in other things too that have nothing to do with minority health or health disparities. I can just be interested in what my interests are as a researcher. But that also, the converse is true as well. People who are white white men can be interested in minority health and health disparities. So really just changing that conversation around, science and who's at the table and what our interests are, but then also being interested in those things that are impacting the lives of many people across our global community. Improving your workplace culture, that's, looking in the mirror is so important. How are we contributing to the problem? Not just the problem exists outside, but it happens right here. And I will tell you, we've done a lot of data collection and analyzing. We looked at our directors awards and shared that information with Dr. Collins, the disparities we found in directors awards. And he's been mortified. I had no idea. So really looking at, taking a look at your own organizations and identifying disparities there, and then not just identifying them. Okay, we've identified them, great. But now what are you going to do about it? And having some real concrete actions that are going to come from the identifying of the disparities that may exist in your organizations. Being communicative and transparent with what you're trying to do always helps when you're trying something new. So making sure that people know what you're doing, that you do what you say you're going to do. If things have to change, then being clear about why those things had to change. I will tell you, one of the things we said early on is every institute and center is going to have a chief diversity officer. Well, pretty early on, our institutes and centers said, look, we're not as big as that organization over there. how are we going to have a chief diversity officer? We don't need that. We need something else. We need something different. And so we had to change course really quickly. And that led to a lot of pushback from our workforce saying, see, you're doing this bait and switch. So what we did is say, okay, well, where it's applicable, people can use a chief diversity officer or other means, but every single IC director or institute and center director is going to have a PMAP element now, a performance appraisal element. And that was even, people are like, oh, well, forget about this chief diversity officer you promised us. You mean it's actually going into our institute and center directors' performance appraisals? Wow. So yeah, we had to change course, but we explained the reason why. And then we had a solution that said, here's something else we can do. But again, communicating that across our workforce was really helpful. And then extramurally, we work with a number of different organizations. So not everyone has, uses the extramural language, but I will say you have external stakeholders that are outside of NHF or your own organizations. How do you bring them into the fold too, that you're all working together? I told you we started this, but now CDC is talking about it. And there are other federal organizations that are working on this, starting to do this work. So how do we coordinate across that landscape, the federal landscape in particular, to do this together and to learn from each other and to identify promising practices that we can all integrate into our work. So you can take all of those aspects of the UNITE initiative and make it work for you all.
Great. That's great. So we're coming up against the hour. I think we have time for one last question, and I think this is a great one to end on. And it is, if you had to name one thing, what would you suggest all of us could start doing today to end structural racism? I had to put you on the spot.
You did. I love it though. I love it though. So I'm going to answer this in a personal way. I grew up in what's called South Central LA. It may be called South LA now, but that's where I was born. And she didn't make a lot of money. She made no more than $24,000 her entire life. I moved to Seattle and I worked with families in Seattle that looked like me, were low income, and I was seeing the same things happening in that community. And then when I did my student teaching before I was a teacher, I've seen the same things happening in communities that were low income, that were communities of color in San Diego. Then I taught in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I saw the same things I was seeing in Seattle, LA, San Diego, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And so then it dawned on me, I said, this is a bigger issue than just what's happening in our community. This is happening across our country. It's amazing. So I got to go work for the federal government. Now, I'm not saying all of you should go and do that, but what I will say is, for me, it's personal for me, but I think it's personal for everyone. Each one of us will benefit from other people having the same access to opportunities that we all have, right? There's no losers in addressing a wrong that has been that has existed in our society for a very, very long time. I will tell you, when I was made the program manager for UNITE, and because I moved out to work for the federal government years ago, 11 years ago, I was going to come and I was going to change the world. And I promptly did not change the world. I came into the federal government and was working in the Office of Human Resources, and it was not doing anything related to what I said I was going to do. But I made a call, and I called my mom, number one, and I said, Mom, remember that promise I made you that I was going to come out to the federal government, I was going to make change? I'm doing it. I got that job. And I call back all those people I worked with, those families in Seattle, my old colleagues that I was working, and I say, I'm doing this now. I've made a promise to you and I'm holding my promise. So what promises do you make to yourself, right? What is it that you see that you want to see changed in, with regard to structural racism? How do you see it impacting your own life or the lives of people around you? And then do it. Just do it. There's nothing getting in the way of us fighting to ensure that we all have access to equal opportunity and equity across our global landscape. And so, I'll say our national, we'll start with the US, but just do it, just do it. I don't know how else to say that other than to say what I said, but hopefully that helps to answer, at least for you, what drives me. It's personal, but it's also, I know that other people benefit when we all have access.
I'd say that does I'd say that does a lot more than just answer the question. Thank you for sharing the personal story there too. That's just awesome. That's incredible. And this is fun. It's just great to hear. So, and I'd say you're in a pretty good position to change the world here. So you're definitely on track.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you, Victoria. We thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We just really appreciate your time and your expertise, and I just can't thank you enough for being here today.
It's my pleasure. So I'm going to challenge you all a year from now, next October, call us back and have us come back and talk to you. And then put me on the spot, hold my feet to the fire, say, Victoria, you said you were going to do X, Y, and Z. Did you do it? And I'll have to be honest, because that's what, this is all about, being transparent. But please have us come back. We would love to do that.
You bet. And I'm going to take you up on that too.
All right.
All right.
All right. Thank you
all.
Take
care, Victoria. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.